The snow had begun to fall before the sun had properly risen. Not the grand, storybook flakes that descend with gentle ceremony, but rather the sort of grim, wet slush that crept in through the seams of your boots and made the soul feel damp. It slicked the wooden shingles of the barracks. It turned the palace courtyards to grey paste. And it ran down the curved stone gutters like melted candle wax from the sky. In the early hours of that winter morning in Kazan, in the year 1553, the city did not yet know it would be remembered, not for its rivers, not for its golden mosques, not even for the blood it had so often spilled, but for a slave. Not a prince, not a warlord, not even a general. Just a slave. But it is always the quiet corners that fate chooses when it wishes to roar. The Tsar had risen early, perhaps disturbed by dreams or perhaps, more mundanely, by the grating aches of gout that now plagued his left leg. Ivan IV, later to be called the Terrible, though not quite, sat alone in a warm chamber lined with velvet drapery, regarding the fire. Not a man who smiled easily. Not a man who trusted his own breath if it came too softly. Servants hovered. Always hovering. Some born into servitude, some pressed into it after wars. Faces from Livonia, Georgia, Circassia, the Crimea. And one among them, a quiet man with the wiry build of one who had learned to carry more than his body ever should, moved through the Tsar's rooms with the grace of a shadow trained not to be seen. His name was Yunus. Or at least, that's what they called him. No one asked what his real name was. No one cared. To the court, he was a pair of hands, a set of shoulders, a set of sandaled feet that brought pails of water to the bathhouse, stirred the coals for the hypocaust, hauled linen steeped in blood and lye. He did not speak unless addressed. When addressed, he kept his eyes downcast. When permitted to look up, he blinked slowly, like a cat that had learned the hard way not to stare at open flames. He had once been something else, surely. He moved too elegantly for a man broken from childhood. His posture was too upright for someone bred on servitude. There was music in the way he poured a basin, poetry in the way he set down a pot without clatter. But the palace had no interest in who Yunus had been before he became theirs. The state had no memory for its own thieves. Still, Yunus remembered. He remembered the village. He remembered the way the wind used to move across the steppe, the strange gentleness of it, like the skirts of God brushing over the grass. He remembered his sister's laughter, bright and strange as the sky before lightning. He remembered the day the soldiers came, Muscovite and Tatar both, iron teeth grinning beneath furred helmets, their voices heavy with vodka and command. And now, he remembered what it felt like to boil water slowly, very slowly. But that memory, the last one, belonged to a day not yet come. For now he served. In the bathhouse, the ceiling arched high overhead, ribbed with brick and damp with the breath of steam. The Tsar's private bathing quarters were lined with white marble, veins of pink curling through like blood vessels beneath pale skin. The scent was a mix of pine tar, sweat, and the sharp tang of birchwood oil, soaked into the walls after years of ceremonial scrubbing. Yunus stoked the coals, one after another. The fire growled in return, and he fed it like a priest giving offerings to a temperamental god. His fingers were cracked. His palms were calloused. His back hurt in ways he'd long since stopped cataloging. Behind him, the guards murmured, slapping gloved hands together, half to stay warm and half to stay awake. They never watched Yunus closely. Why would they? He was, to them, as animate as the bucket he carried. On that morning, a new noble had arrived at the palace. A boyar of no great repute but immense arrogance, the kind who sniffed at his own coat as though offended it had not yet been perfumed with praise. Prince Semyon, they called him. A distant cousin of the Tsar, and therefore entitled, by sheer accident of womb, to the full courtesies of the realm. He requested the bathhouse. Of course he did. Requested it to be heated more than usual. He had rheumatism, he claimed. Or perhaps a ghost in his bones. One never knew with these pale men who wrapped their ailments in poetry to seem delicate. Yunus said nothing. He only nodded and made the preparations. The baths were simple in concept. Heat water. Pour it over the marble. Let the rising steam sweat out the sin or the sickness or the shame, whatever the Lord needed to wash away that morning. And for men like Prince Semyon, there was much to steam away. There was a girl with him. Not his wife. Too young to be his wife. Likely not even paid for the visit, just caught up in his orbit like a feather sucked into a blacksmith's bellows. She didn't speak. She stared at the fire, and her eyes were glass. Yunus caught her gaze once. Just once. And in that moment, something ancient and volcanic cracked behind his ribs. A terrible, impossible question began to shape itself in the silence of his thoughts. Why do we serve? Why do we boil water so that the men who burned our homes can sigh in comfort? But he turned away. He kept stoking. And the fire kept grinning. The truth was that the palace, for all its silks and ivory, reeked of rot. Not the visible kind, not the flesh-melting leprosy or the stench of plague. No, this was spiritual rot. Moral gangrene. A soft, creeping blackness that made men believe they were gods because no one dared remind them they were only men. And Yunus watched. He watched for years. He watched Prince Semyon stumble out of the bathhouse, bleary and satisfied, speaking of how the water had healed him. He watched the girl limp behind him, her slippers stained. He watched the Tsar himself whisper things into the ears of advisors that made their eyes widen, then nod, then vanish from the record altogether. He watched boyars laugh too loudly, drink too deeply, hurt too quietly. Until, one day, something in him stopped watching and began planning. It did not happen overnight. Vengeance is not a horse you gallop wildly. It is a beast you bridle with patience. He began to experiment. Slowly, carefully. Adjusting temperatures. Testing the limits of bone, of skin, of silence. The bathhouse had many compartments. Some used, some forgotten. There were places in the hypocaust where coals could be left to simmer beneath grates no longer regularly inspected. There were ducts where screams could vanish like breath into frost. He practiced with animals first. Not proudly. Not out of cruelty. Simply for calibration. A rat will boil differently than a man, but the principle holds. Time. Temperature. Amount of water. Position of the grate. Ventilation. Every detail mattered. And the bathhouse was his kingdom. No one else knew it like he did. No one else listened to it. Not really. Not the way he did, the way one listens to a heartbeat when lying with their ear pressed to a loved one's chest. He knew the cracks in the tiles where a scald could spread. He knew the way condensation formed along the copper piping when the air grew too thick. He knew how to muffle the screams, if it came to that. But he did not think it would. Not yet. Because people like Prince Semyon didn't scream, not at first. They commanded. And their voices would rise with indignation before they ever rose with pain. By the time they understood the difference, it would be too late. He practiced for months. And waited for the right guests. The ones who had danced at the slaughter of his village. The ones who laughed when blood pooled under the banners. The ones who took and never paid. The royal family itself, of course, was too far. Too protected. Too sacred, even in its filth. But then word came. A visit. The Tsar's cousin. His wife. His brother. 2 of their sons. All scheduled to bathe together, as was the custom in some noble households. A strange kind of cleanliness, communal and ceremonial and self-satisfied. And they requested Yunus. Of course they did. He was efficient. Quiet. Thorough. He was perfect. And so he bowed. And he stoked. And the fire began to smile again. They arrived just after midday, wrapped in layers of fur and entitlement, their voices trailing behind them like the hems of their coats. The servants peeled the layers away. Yunus did not look up. He did not speak. The cousin, Prince Alexei, commented on the warmth of the air, already impressed. Like a womb, he said, laughing, nudging his wife. You'll be born again, my love. Yunus smiled. Politely. The water steamed. The fire burned. And somewhere far below, the grates began to glow. He did not plan to make it quick. He did not plan to make it merciful, but he did plan to make it silent, because silence was the only voice that had ever been his. And now, he would let it speak. The floor of the bathhouse was warm to the soles, not yet scalding, but with a growing heat that pulsed like a second heartbeat beneath the marble. The walls perspired. Beads of condensation gathered and dripped with slow, deliberate rhythm, like the fingers of an unseen god playing some ancient percussion instrument lost to memory. Yunus moved like a man possessed by reverence. Not the kind shown to kings, but the kind shown to the dead, slow, solemn, deliberate. He laid the towels just so. He added herbs to the copper bowl resting above the central grate: juniper, birch, mint. The kind of blend that could almost hide the smell of burning skin, if it came to that. A servant girl, no older than 14, entered with a stack of linens. Her face was pale from the cold outside, her cheeks still carrying the red handprints of the wind. Yunus nodded to her, and she lowered her eyes instantly, instinctively. It was the first rule of service in the bathhouse: do not speak unless you wish to lose your tongue. There was precedent. The girl stepped carefully, but the floor's heat made her flinch. Yunus took the linens from her quickly. He did not want her staying long. The prince's party was already disrobing in the antechamber, their laughter a thick, meaty sound. Not like music. Like chewing. "Go," he whispered to her, barely audible. She obeyed. She did not look back. Behind the curtain, the royal cousin bellowed at a manservant about wine. He wanted wine in the bath. Not near it. In it. Apparently, the Venetians did such things. And if it was good enough for Venice, then surely Russia could afford the decadence. His wife giggled, but it was the practiced giggle of someone who had giggled at every horror from cradle to court, as if laughter might distract the wolves from their door. The boys, one 16, the other younger, shoved each other and bragged in the way only boys with too much power and not enough history can. Yunus listened. He always listened. The sound of a body easing into hot water was not unlike that of dough hitting oil. A quick hiss, a muffled sigh. The water here was not merely warm, it was hot. He had fed the fire without pause for the past 6 hours, layer upon layer of birch and pine, stacked with precision in the lower chambers until the marble itself sang with heat. Prince Alexei entered first, settling himself into the sunken bath with a loud grunt. "God's arse, that's something," he said. "I feel like I'm melting. Is that good? It must be good." His wife slipped in after him. Yunus had added extra oil to her section. The heat would cling to it, amplify it, creep beneath the skin. Yunus, ever silent, knelt by the edge and ladled hot water over the prince's shoulders. "More," Alexei said. "Don't be stingy, bath rat." Yunus ladled again. The younger boy yelped as he stepped in. "It burns!" "Because you're weak," his brother scoffed. "No, truly, it burns." Their mother laughed lightly, but there was hesitation now. The floor tiles beneath her feet were redder than they had been minutes before. Not a painted red. A glowing red. Faint at first, barely visible through the steam, but unmistakably growing brighter. "Is it hotter than usual?" she asked finally. Yunus did not respond. He simply adjusted the copper bowl above the vent. Inside it, herbs had begun to blacken. The scent of mint turned acrid. Something in the air had changed. There is a moment, just a moment, when a body submerged in heat crosses the threshold from pleasure to pain. It is not always immediately perceived. The mind resists it. The flesh protests, but the mind says no, no, this is health, this is rejuvenation, this is good. Until it can no longer lie. And then the screaming begins. The younger boy scrambled from the bath, his feet slipping on the wet marble. His skin was flush-deep crimson, his arms already blistering. He fell. Cried out. Tried to stand again. Couldn't. His palms left wet prints where they slapped the tile, prints that hissed when he moved away. The older brother cursed. Stumbled out after him. His legs buckled. The prince stood halfway up, water pouring off him like sap off a tree that's just been split. His skin had begun to slough from his thighs. He screamed. But the scream was short, half a breath, really, before his voice cracked and vanished, leaving only a choking rasp. The mother was frozen. Not by indecision, but by literal heat. Her limbs would not move. Her muscles had seized. Her eyes locked on Yunus, standing there, calm, unmoving. "What?" she gasped. Yunus, with utmost serenity, reached behind the pillar and lifted a lever. A low groan sounded beneath the bathhouse, deep and metallic. The grates below the water's surface opened further, allowing a rush of heat from the hypocaust to surge directly into the pools. Steam billowed up in white, rolling clouds. The temperature rose by 5 degrees in seconds. They screamed then. All of them. Real screams this time. Not indignant. Not princely. Just human. Yunus stood, watched, and did not blink. He had seen worse done to his sister. And no one had blinked then. The boyar's face had become grotesque, nose peeled, lips blanched. He tried to pull himself out of the bath with arms that no longer responded to his commands. The mother howled, a sound so feral it made the marble tremble. The boys cried and cried, their voices mingling in high, desperate harmony. Alexei tried to rise. Yunus kicked his shoulder gently, just enough to tip his balance. The prince slipped back into the water. This time, he did not scream. Only the youngest still had strength to move. He crawled on all fours, skin trailing behind him in ribbons, toward the edge of the bathhouse. Yunus blocked the door. The fire below roared. From outside, there was no sound. The bathhouse was sealed thickly, as all were in Russian winter. Steam did not escape. Neither did voices. The guards at the entrance, posted out of ceremony rather than necessity, stood drowsily against the cold, gossiping about the recent execution of a noblewoman for speaking ill of the Tsar's marriage prospects. The screams had begun to weaken. There is something chilling in that moment when cries taper, not because relief has come, but because strength has left. They were dying now. The bathwater bubbled faintly. The marble, even far from the fire, was now hot enough to blister. Yunus waited. He stood still for another full hour after the last gurgle faded. It is one thing to plan revenge, another to execute it, and something entirely more ancient to sit beside it, cradle it like a newborn, and not feel your soul recoil. But Yunus did not recoil. He only sat. He thought of his mother's hands. How they smelled of bread and milkweed. How they had held him during a storm and told him the gods had not forgotten them. He thought of the man who had taken her. He had not been in this bath. But maybe someday. When the steam thinned, Yunus approached the pool. What remained was barely human. Flesh had turned waxy, muscle had separated from bone. One of the boys had tried to climb the copper spout, and now his body was locked in place, mid-thrust, his back split open where it met the heated metal. There were no survivors. Yunus began to drain the water. It moved slowly, thick with the detritus of death. He washed the walls, the towels, the copper basin. Every inch of the bathhouse was scrubbed clean, not of blood, for there was little, but of evidence. The guards were bribed with drink later that night, sent on errands that kept them away from the hall for precisely 2 hours. By the time the disappearance was discovered, the bathhouse gleamed. And Yunus had disappeared. Not gone, but transformed. He returned the next morning with a limp and a nosebleed. Claimed he had slipped in the snow on an errand and only just returned. The bodies were found, eventually. Or parts of them. But the royal court, faced with such horror, chose, out of convenience and cowardice, not to ask too many questions. They said it was a terrible accident. That the fire system malfunctioned. That perhaps the bathhouse was cursed. And they shut it down. Yunus was reassigned. But his work was not finished. Because what begins with fire often ends in something colder. The snow fell harder in the weeks that followed, as if the sky itself wished to bury what had happened beneath layers of white silence. And for a time, the palace allowed it. The royal cousin and his family were mourned with a measured sorrow, the kind that is more inconvenience than heartbreak. There were rituals, of course, endless bells and black cloth and murmured prayers offered by priests who never once asked why a noble family had boiled like meat in a sealed chamber. Some stories are too dangerous to investigate, even more dangerous to believe. Yunus, meanwhile, became quieter than ever. He did not cower. He did not disappear. He simply returned to the invisible position where slaves belong, at the edge of every room, at the bottom of every list, in the spaces between orders where no eyes wandered. The court's attention shifted quickly. There was always something new to dress, to poison, to punish. A rebellion in the north. A wedding in the west. A comet in the sky, trailing light like a burning whip, which the Tsar took as either a divine warning or a divine endorsement. He had not yet decided. But in the quarters where servants slept on straw and coughed through nights thick with soot, something had changed. They had heard the rumors. Not the official ones, those were toothless. But the secret ones. The ones whispered at night, after 3 sips of potato spirit, with the door barred and eyes wide in the dark. They say someone boiled them on purpose. They say he stood there and watched. They say it was a slave. They never said his name. Most didn't know it. But those who had worked the bathhouse before, they had seen how he moved, how he waited. They said nothing aloud, but they knew, and they were not afraid. Something else stirred in them, something long buried. Not rebellion exactly, not yet, but recognition. They too had lost things. They too had names no one used anymore. And as winter thickened like fat in a cold pot, the servants began to pass each other different kinds of messages. Not words. Looks. Nods. A hand paused slightly too long on a shoulder. A broom leaning the wrong way against a wall. The rhythm of a knock on a door. Small things. Insignificant to anyone in power. But history, more often than not, begins with small things. Yunus spent more time now in the kitchens. The reassignment had been seen as a demotion, but it gave him access to something far more valuable than status. Ingredients. And he remembered every poison his grandmother had whispered about. She had known which roots made the heart stop, and which made the stomach twist in agonies that mimicked plague. She had known the flowers that masked their scent and the mushrooms that imitated meat when fried in butter. She had died screaming, face down in the dirt, the day the soldiers came. But her recipes remained. He began collecting, quietly, methodically. Not stealing. Merely misplacing. A pinch of wolfsbane here. A stalk of monkshood there. Dried foxglove, slipped between pages of a recipe book that no noble ever touched. And still, he waited. Because vengeance, true vengeance, is never rushed. A noblewoman, Lady Varia, became ill first. She was not a target. She was a test. Her food was simple, barley stew with pork and a hint of parsnip. Nothing exotic. Nothing risky. But the parsnip had been replaced. She died 4 hours after dinner. Vomiting blood, unable to speak, clutching her maid's hand until her fingers snapped. The physician blamed her age. She was 28. The kitchen steward was flogged. But not dismissed. Because what noble truly believed a servant had the gall to kill. Yunus did not flinch as the lash bit into the man's back. He did not flinch when the steward, sobbing into the floor, begged to know who had done it. He simply offered him a basin to wash the blood. Then he looked him in the eye and said, "You were brave." It was a strange thing to say, but not strange enough to spark alarm. Just strange enough to haunt. Weeks passed. Then another. A captain of the guard. A man named Timothy. Broad. Cruel. Fond of dragging girls by the hair into empty rooms, of tying up young boys for discipline. He choked to death on a dumpling stuffed with something that was not pork. His tongue turned black before he hit the ground. There were inquiries. But again, nothing. No servant was so bold. No cook so suicidal. Only misfortune. Only coincidence. Yunus was moved again. This time, to laundry. It was meant as a punishment. But to Yunus, it was a library. Clothes told stories. Bloodstains, handprints, the faintest smear of lipstick. He catalogued them like a scholar with manuscripts. The Tsar's robes were heavy with sweat and something else, something sour. His mistress's silks carried the scent of fear. His guards? Their linens were often stiff with what no one dared name. Yunus did not judge. He merely observed. And he made a new kind of map. Not of streets. Of secrets. There is a hierarchy in palaces. Not just of rank, but of rot. Power trickles downward, but so does filth. And where filth settles, so too does opportunity. He found it in the form of a young page named Vasily. Vasily was the kind of boy the palace chewed through quickly, soft-hearted, soft-spoken, not yet hardened into cruelty. He moved too gently. He asked too many questions. And one day, he found Yunus kneeling by the washing barrels and asked, "Why do you never speak to anyone?" Yunus looked up. And for the first time in months, he answered, "I have nothing to say." Vasily blinked. Then, carefully asked, "Did you see the ones who died in the bath?" Yunus studied the boy. He was thin, pale, hungry for truth. "Yes," he said. "Did they suffer?" "Yes." Vasily swallowed. "Good," he whispered. And just like that, a new thread was tied. The boy began to help. First with small things, delivering messages, distracting guards, switching pails. Then more. It was Vasily who gave Yunus the list. Not intentionally. Not even knowingly. He had been bragging to a kitchen girl about having access to the Tsar's private papers. He mentioned a list. A short one. 5 names. People marked for favor. People the Tsar trusted absolutely. It was written in red ink. Vasily hadn't read it. But he had seen the initials. He remembered 3. Yunus wrote them down. And something inside him changed. Because revenge was no longer random. It was becoming orchestral. Each death, a new movement in a symphony only he could hear. But he would need help. Real help. And for that, he turned to someone he had once feared. Her name was Zuleika. She worked the outer kitchens, the ones that served the lesser nobles and traveling dignitaries. She was older than Yunus. Sharper, too. Her tongue could flay a man cleaner than a blade. She had buried 2 sons, both taken for war, either returned. When he approached her, she did not look up. "Whatever you're offering, I don't want it," she said. "I'm offering justice," he replied. That made her pause. Then she said something that, to this day, echoes in palaces far older than this one. "Justice is a word liars use when they want your hands bloody." Yunus nodded. "I'm not a liar." She turned then. Met his eyes. "You're not clean either." "No." She smiled. Thin, bitter. "Good." And so the fire spread. Quietly. Deliberately. Through the kitchens. Through the laundries. Through the shadows between hallways. Not a rebellion. Not yet. But something worse. A memory. The palace had taught them to forget who they were. But Yunus was teaching them to remember. And soon, blood would remember too. The cold began to retreat from the city like a defeated army. Spring arrived without ceremony, with muddy roads and swollen rivers, and a sun that rose each morning like it had only half decided to show up. Trees bloomed in awkward tufts. Birds returned like debtors to a home they didn't miss. And inside the palace, the fires kept burning. Not literal ones, those were now carefully regulated, inspected 3 times daily ever since the accident in the bathhouse, but quieter fires. Hungers, hatreds, whisperings. A furnace of intentions ignited in the backs of eyes, in the corners of mouths when no one was looking. The kind of fires that wear human skin like a mask. Yunus walked through the halls the way wind moves through ruins. Not fast, not dramatic. Just present, relentless, impossible to pin down. He was still laundering clothes. Still invisible. Still listening. But now the machine he'd been building had begun to turn. Zuleika, for her part, did not believe in half measures. After she agreed to help, she started naming names before Yunus had even asked. Antonov. He's one, she said, snapping chicken necks behind the pantry curtain. Had a boy whipped to death last year. For stealing apples. What happened to the apples? Yunus asked. She grunted. They rotted. Never even touched them. That was Antonov. Master of ceremonies. Always perfectly dressed, always smelling faintly of rose oil and sickly almonds. His role was to organize the Tsar's public appearances and keep order at court functions, part director, part decorator, part predator. He liked things quiet. He liked things polished. And he liked his pleasures to leave no bruises visible in daylight. Antonov had taken a new servant the previous week. A mute girl, maybe 12, maybe younger. No one knew her name. But Yunus watched the bruises bloom like poppies on her forearms. So he made Antonov's wine taste like summer. Summer in a field of henbane. The man collapsed mid-banquet, foaming, seizing, soiling himself as horrified nobles turned their heads away in distaste, not fear. No one screamed. Screamers were poor guests. The Tsar's advisors ordered an investigation. It concluded that Antonov had likely had a weak heart. We all knew it, said one boyar. He was too sensitive. A man who flayed children with the back of his spoon. Too sensitive. And then the Tsar himself grew interested. Not in Antonov. In the pattern. He noticed something most of his court did not. People he disliked were dying. People he didn't trust. People who had whispered, once, that he was not strong enough. And so the Tsar, Ivan, then 23, not yet monstrous in name but growing in shadow, began to hold meetings at night. Private ones. With men who never smiled. With men who knew things. The Oprichnina would not be declared for another 3 years. But its roots began in those midnight meetings. The seed of state terror. The idea that the court must be cleansed. Not of filth. Of doubt. Yunus was unaware of these meetings. But he felt their tremors. The palace air grew tense. Servants whispered less. People laughed too loud at the Tsar's jokes. A boy was whipped publicly for sneezing during a prayer. And in the bathhouse, quiet since the deaths, the water pipes were repaired, polished, and closed forever. Out of respect. But nothing in palaces stays closed for long. Meanwhile, Zuleika had begun organizing her own council. Not of equals. Of the willing. There was Myrov, the coffin maker's son who worked as a butcher's apprentice. There was Alina, the seamstress who stitched pearls into dresses for girls sent off to foreign courts like fattened pigeons. There was the gravetender who had once buried his own brother without a marker because the boy had insulted a prince and gotten caught. Each of them had a story. And now they had a leader. They didn't call him by name. Not aloud. Not even in private. They called him the Steam. Because when steam rises, it fills a room without knocking. Because it burns. Without needing a sword. And so, the Steam moved from place to place, collecting sins like others collect coins. In the Tsar's private chambers, a new advisor arrived. He was a priest. Of sorts. A tall, hawk-eyed man named Filaret. A mystic. A philosopher. A poison in the robes of a healer. He spoke to the Tsar of purity. Of how rot begins not in the body, but in the soul. That traitors must be identified not by what they do, but by what they fail to believe. Yunus watched this man, once, from a hallway corner. Filaret had passed without looking at him. But Yunus had felt something. Recognition. Not personal. Philosophical. This man, too, believed in cleansing. Yunus just used hotter water. And then came the night of the pigeons. It was a game the younger nobles played. They would get drunk and tie pigeons by their legs to the spires of the eastern tower, then shoot at them with crossbows from the roof while reciting lines of poetry. It was considered artistic. One night, a girl servant named Mila was dared to run between the tower and the garden fountain during the hunt. She made it halfway. And when the bolt hit her spine, the nobles laughed. Hard. Loud. Only one boy turned pale. A page. Vasily. He vomited behind a pillar. The girl was buried quietly. Her family was paid. And 3 days later, a nobleman named Dmitri, who had fired the bolt, drowned in a fountain full of boiling goose fat. They found his eyes still open, mouth frozen in a half-laugh. The next day, guards were doubled. Servants were searched. Yunus wasn't. He was delivering linens to the Tsar's cousin's widow, the one who had screamed the loudest once in the bath. She didn't recognize him. Grief had softened her, made her quiet. She wore black. She touched her throat when she spoke. She died 3 weeks later. Natural causes, they said. But no one asked why the water she drank had smelled faintly of copper and lilies. The palace was beginning to ache. Not just in fear. In guilt. A strange, dull guilt that didn't know its source, only that something was coming. Something with hands. Something with purpose. The Tsar, sensing weakness in the bones of his household, began issuing decrees. New punishments. Public floggings. One servant was sewn into a sack with a wild cat and thrown into the river. Another had his tongue nailed to a chopping block for reciting a poem that ended with the phrase, "Better a hungry dog than a rich fool." He hadn't written the poem. He just liked the rhyme. Zuleika watched this all with a growing snarl. "It's tightening," she said one night, as she cut garlic on a board that also held a rusted knife and a list of names. Yunus nodded. "Then we must move faster." She raised an eyebrow. "You say that like we're at war." "We are." "With who?" He looked at her and said, "Everyone who's forgotten what mercy sounds like." And so came the night of ash. It was not a fire. Not in the literal sense. But by dawn, for noble families would be wiped clean from the court register. Poisoned, vanished, burned in chimneys, drowned in their own ceremonial wine. The court panicked. Guards were called. Doors were broken. Confessions were beaten from people who knew nothing. And the Tsar, for the first time, said the word, traitor, out loud in his own chambers. Yunus, meanwhile, stood by a laundry vat. Stirring. He stirred like it was soup. Thick linen. Blood. The faint smell of herbs. Vasily passed him, pale. "You did all of it?" he whispered. Yunus didn't answer. "You can't keep going." "I must." "Why?" Yunus paused. Then said, "Because no one else will." And somewhere, deep in the palace crypts, behind a door sealed with rusted chains, the Tsar ordered the reopening of the vault. It was where enemies of the state were kept, long before there was a state. Before Muscovy. Before words. Only darkness. And hunger. The Tsar smiled when he signed the order. Because for every quiet fire, he now had his own. The vault was not on any official blueprint of the Kremlin. Not etched on any court map. Not listed in the Tsar's gilded inventory of strongholds, arsenals, or prisons. And yet it existed, beneath the oldest wing of the palace, beneath a chapel that no one worshipped in anymore, behind an altar whose holy cross had been bent into the shape of a question. It had once served as a wine cellar, then a place for hiding valuables during sieges. Then it became something darker. A place for containment. And like all places built to contain, it eventually became a place for transformation. The Tsar walked there himself the night it was reopened. Cloaked in black. Accompanied only by Philaret and 2 guards whose names were later struck from all records. Philaret carried a lantern. The Tsar carried a prayer. The kind of prayer men say not to ask for mercy, but to remind God to stay out of the way. They descended slowly. The walls narrowed as they went. Moisture clung to the stones like sweat. The air was thick with old salt and older sins. It reeked of mildew and mold, yes, but also of rusted chains, a breath once held too long. At the bottom, the door. Iron. Nearly 3 palms thick. Hinged not with bolts but with bones, actual bones, twisted into frames, lacquered with wax, and sealed in place centuries before the Tsar's grandfather was born. No one spoke. Philaret handed the Tsar a key. It was small. Black. It hummed faintly. The Tsar paused only once before inserting it. He did not ask himself whether this was wise. He had moved past wisdom. He only asked if it would work. The door opened with a sound like something being remembered. And what they found inside was not empty. There were shelves, tables, glass vials, scrolls and languages the Tsar had banned personally, and a chair. In the center, facing the wall. On the chair sat a man, or what was left of one. His hair was white, or possibly gray, it was hard to tell, as most of it had fallen out in clumps. His skin had the color and texture of candle wax. His hands were long, too long. His eyes opened before anyone spoke. He smiled. Not a welcoming smile. A knowing one. Like he had been waiting. Philaret stepped back. The Tsar did not. "Tell me," the Tsar said. "Do you remember how to kill a soul?" The man tilted his head. His lips cracked as he spoke. "Do you want it quiet, or honest?" And thus began the other side of the story. While Yunus and his quiet coalition, the Steam, as Whispers now called it, continued their quiet campaign through poisoned goblets, slit throats, and boiling mirrors, the Tsar was beginning his own campaign. Through purification. Through fear. Through memory. He began creating a ledger. Names. Faces. Family lines. Not of those who were guilty, but of those who might become so. Philaret supplied the theology. The vault supplied the tools. And the Tsar began to cleanse. Yunus felt the change immediately. Where once his murders had been treated with confusion, even negligence, now they were met with precision. Punishments became sharper. Surveillance increased. Bodies no longer vanished. They were displayed. One morning, the laundry courtyard bore a new decoration. 3 laundry boys strung up by their aprons, guts steaming in the pale light. One of them was Vasily's friend. The parchment nailed to their feet read, "Dirt must be washed from the cloth." Zuleika was furious. "They're learning," she hissed, pacing the cellar beneath the outer kitchen. "No," Yunus said. "They're panicking. They're organizing." Yunus nodded. "Then we push." The next death was not a noble. It was a midwife. Old. Harmless. Illiterate. But she had once refused to lie about a stillborn child belonging to a high lord's mistress. The lord had ordered her hands broken. Slowly. With a hammer. Yunus left the man's heart in a washbasin. The court howled. The Tsar howled louder. He summoned Philaret. He summoned the man from the vault, whose name no one ever learned. He summoned the blacksmiths and told them, "Make me masks. Make me coats. Make me fear you can wear." And from that order, the black dogs were born. They were not officially called that. Their insignia was a skull beneath a wheel. But the people named them black dogs. Because they howled in the night. Because they hunted. Because they did not let go once they bit. They wore black leather. Iron masks. They rode black horses. They operated under no known law. They answered only to the Tsar. And their first act was to storm the servant quarters. It was not a raid. It was a warning. They dragged out 10 men, 10 women, randomly, publicly, and burned them alive in the central courtyard. One of them was a girl who had helped deliver laundry once for Yunus. She had a limp, a soft voice, a laugh like a breeze through chimes. They stuffed her mouth with ash before she screamed. Yunus watched. He did not intervene. Zuleika wept for the first time in years. Myrov sharpened knives until he broke one. And still, Yunus remained calm. Because the fire had gotten too loud now. Too fast. It was time to slow it again. It was time to whisper. He chose a different tactic. The Tsar had a food taster, of course. But what of the Tsar's horses? What of his dog, the large mastiff that slept at the foot of his bed and was said to bark at any man who harbored ill intent? One night the dog howled. Not at a man. at the mirror. Its fur fell out over 2 days. Its eyes turned yellow. It died on the third. The Tsar screamed when he found it. He demanded its body be preserved. It was not, because Yunus had taken it and replaced it with something else, something far older. Its bones carved with letters that didn't belong to this land. Its jaw filled with salt. The Tsar began to dream then of the bathhouse, of boiling, of screams he had not heard, but now could feel. He slept less. He spoke less. He feared more. Philaret suggested moving the court. Just temporarily. Somewhere south. The Tsar refused. If I run from steam, he muttered, I will drown in rain. Yunus knew then. The Tsar was afraid. Truly afraid. And that meant the time had come. For the Tsar himself. Zuleika argued. He is not yours, she said. He did not hurt your sister. He did not burn your home. He burned others, Yunus said. That's not enough. He turned to her. It's always enough. And that night, he left a package at the Tsar's door. It was wrapped in cloth from the bathhouse. Inside, nothing but a note. I am not done boiling. The Tsar did not open his chambers for 3 days. When he did, he ordered every single bath in the Kremlin destroyed. Wells poisoned. Ovens sealed. He did not understand. But he felt the heat. And still, Yunus was not finished. Because what boils once, boils again. And this time, he would not be alone. The storm did not come with thunder. It came with footsteps. Soft ones. Measured. A procession of the forgotten. On the first night of the third boiling, the palace kitchens were unusually quiet. Fires burned low. The pots were half-filled. None of the cooks spoke. They stirred broth like mourners stirring ash. Each had heard the rumors, no longer murmurs now, but instructions, passed on from hand to hand, ear to ear, like relics. At midnight, Yunus lit a candle with fingers that no longer shook. It was short, black, unscented. The kind used in death rites, the kind his mother had once hidden beneath the floorboards before the soldiers came and laughed as they burned her tongue out. The candle was a signal. From the laundry quarter, from the grain stores, from the stables they came. Not armed. Not armored. Armed servants looked suspicious. But these came bearing bread. Towels. Milk. Smiles. The usual. Except none of it was usual anymore. Because every tray held something extra. Every bucket, every cup. It had taken years to collect enough. And now it would take hours to deliver it. Across the palace, 100 hands moved like ghosts. Not warriors. Not rebels. Washers. Carriers. The ones who'd always been there, who had laid the towels for the royals' feet, scrubbed the floors slick with noble bile, polished the silver they were never allowed to eat with. They brought tea that burned through the throat, wine that made the mouth go numb, mutton stuffed with crushed seeds that turned bowels to rivers. And no one suspected a thing. Because no one ever suspects the hand that serves. Yunus had orchestrated it like a composer, with Zuleika at his side. She had become the conductor. He had become the sound. They did not need to kill everyone. Just enough to freeze the machine. Just enough to show that the court's gods bled the same. The first to fall was the Tsar's cousin. Another cousin. A thin, spindly man named Kirill who considered himself a poet and a prophet. He died in the middle of reciting his own verse about the divine order of suffering. His eyes rolled back so slowly it seemed rehearsed. No one clapped. They just screamed. The guards arrived 10 minutes later. Too late. The bread he'd eaten had been laced with mushroom caps dried in a servant girl's boot for 6 months. It hadn't even needed to be chewed. One by one, the noble class began to itch. Then sweat. Then seize. By the second night, 43 were dead. All of them had eaten differently. All of them had died the same. The palace exploded into paranoia. Dogs were set loose in the kitchens. Servants were flayed, hung from ceiling beams, displayed like warnings. Still, the deaths continued. And yet no one saw Yunus. Because Yunus had vanished. Or so they thought. He was everywhere now. The air in the hallways. The heat beneath the floor. The blur in the corner of a mirror. To Philaret, this was heresy. "This is not revenge," he said to the Tsar. "This is plague." The Tsar didn't respond. He hadn't eaten in days. He had taken to licking only dried bread crusts, soaked in salt water, blessed 3 times. He did not sleep in his bed anymore. He slept in the hallway, with guards on all sides. And he still dreamed of boiling. In the servant quarters, Zuleika prepared the final task. The harvest, she called it. Not a slaughter. Not a war. A harvest. Of those who had sown pain and thought themselves immune to reaping. Yunus said nothing as she spoke. He was carving something into the table. A name. His sister's. He did not need to speak anymore. He had become an element. The Tsar, maddened, summoned a boyar from Kazan known for cleansing, his own province of dissenters. A man named Chernov. Chernov brought fire. Actual fire. He ordered the outer servants' quarters burned to the ground. Dozens died. Many of them uninvolved. The fire raged for 2 days. Zuleika's youngest daughter was among the dead. She had not been part of the plot. She'd only been sleeping. When they found her, she was curled against a wall, hands over her ears. Zuleika didn't cry. She stopped blinking for 3 days. Then she brought Yunus a knife. And a name. Chernov. Yunus said. Yes. That night, the noble from Kazan bathed in rosewater with 8 guards surrounding his chamber. One by one, the guards collapsed. Not from poison. From sleep. A fine dust. Carried on steam. He never heard Yunus enter. The knife went in beneath the chin. Slow. The Tsar ordered his body flayed and displayed at the southern gate as a deterrent. Instead, it disappeared. All that remained was a piece of parchment pinned to his empty bed. Boiled. Slowly. At last, the Tsar broke. He summoned Philaret. Demanded a mass blessing. A public exorcism. An exorcism of his own court. Philaret obliged. He stood in the palace square with relics, crosses, incense. The people watched. So did the black dogs. It was snowing lightly. The Tsar watched from a window. As Philaret raised his hands, a child servant approached him. Barefoot. Holding a cup. Drink, the boy said. It's from the kitchens. Philaret, not wishing to interrupt the ritual, drank without thinking. Within seconds, his skin blistered. His lips split. He dropped to his knees. Not dead, but burning from within. It was monkshood, mixed with lie. A recipe passed down from a grandmother who had died screaming. The Tsar collapsed. Not from poison. From the weight of it all. The guards picked him up. He shook with fear. He stank of piss. He ordered the vault sealed again. Ordered the black dogs disbanded. Ordered 1,000 lashes for every servant in the palace. No one obeyed. Because there were no servants left. They had left. Not fled. Withdrawn. Quietly. In the night. Like steam after a fire goes out. Only Yunus remained. He did not kill the Tsar. He simply left a final note. Pinned to the throne with the same knife that had opened Chernov's throat. This is not vengeance. This is the memory of what you forgot. And then he walked. Into snow. Into legend. The Tsar reigned for 20 more years. But he never again stepped into a bath. There are silences that ring louder than screams. The palace, once a hive of glittering decay, now sounded like a church with no gods. Long corridors that once echoed with clinking goblets, flirtatious laughter, and the shuffle of slippered feet now held only the slow creak of wood, the wet drip of melted snow off forgotten sills, and the muttered prayers of men too afraid to speak them aloud. The servants were gone. All of them. Not vanished into the night like rebels. Withdrawn, like breath from lungs, like warmth from a dying limb. The court tried to replace them. hired new cooks, new maids, new stewards, imported from the countryside. Fattened and frightened, wide-eyed peasants who had never before seen marble, much less the kind of politics polished across it like blood from a blade. Most fled within a week. Some didn't even last a day. They arrived to find basins that whispered, fires that flickered blue when no one was watching, stairwells that seemed to lead deeper than the blueprints allowed. The palace had changed. It was no longer simply haunted by memory. It had become memory itself. And memory, like fire, has a smell. The Tsar, once called Ivan, now whispered as Grozny, by courtiers behind closed doors, no longer sought explanation. He sought control. Control through decree. Through doctrine. Through fear so cold and constant it scalded. But the more he tightened, the more the cracks multiplied. And from those cracks, stories began to rise. They began in the kitchens of lesser nobles, in the breathless prayers of peasant mothers telling their children not fairy tales, but histories, recounted with reverence, with rhythm, like psalms. They told of the steam, of a slave who killed without blade, without army, without crown, of a man who boiled the royal bloodline not to usurp it, but to shame it, a man who never raised his voice, only the temperature. The legends grew. They said he had walked across the river without breaking the ice, that the snow refused to cover his footprints, that he could kill with a single breath into a kettle, that the bones of the noble dead now lined the furnaces in which poor men cooked soup. Yunus became less a man and more a concept. Like vengeance. Like reckoning. The clergy condemned the stories. And yet they found candles lit to his memory in the corners of burnt-out chapels. The Tsar, hearing these tales, flew into rages. He beat servants until his own hands broke. He demanded portraits be painted of this ghost, only to burn them before the paint dried. He issued orders, capture him, skin him, erase him. But no one knew where to look, because no one knew if he still lived, or if he had ever truly been a man. For all they knew, he was just the first fire that memory had struck in a house soaked with oil. But Yunus was alive. Very much so. He had not fled far. Only to the edge of the forest beyond the frozen river, in a village with no name, no taxes, and no map. A place where even the crows avoided the steeple. He did not hide. He simply lived. He chopped wood, fished, spoke little. The villagers, at first, assumed he was mad, or a holy man, or both. But then the stories followed him, found him. Old women began leaving herbs at his door. Cracked soap, knitted socks. Not as bribes, as offerings. He tried, once, to refuse. But one woman looked him dead in the eye and said, "We give not because you want it. We give because we remember." And that was the truth of it. Yunus had become a memory made flesh. Not a savior. Never that. But something more useful. A proof that those at the bottom could rise, not with swords, not with riots, but with method, with patience, with intention as clean and cutting as heat. Still, he did not stay idle. Each winter he wandered. Not far. Just far enough. A countess in Yaroslavl fell ill after laughing at a beggar. A merchant in Uglich drowned in a kettle meant for dye. A governor in Smolensk disappeared after having his serfs beaten for slow harvests. No pattern. No note. Only heat. Whispers bloomed like frost across windows. He wasn't dead. He was just waiting. He was the punishment that arrived not when you sinned, but when you forgot you had. One night, many years later, a young noblewoman found him. She was no older than 14. Thin. With a limp. She knocked 3 times on the door of his cabin, then waited, eyes down, shoulders shaking from cold. He opened the door. Said nothing. She looked up. "My father drowned my brother for spilling wine," she said. Silence. "I don't want to live in that house." Still silence. "I don't want revenge," she added quietly. "I want to know what to do." He stepped aside. Let her in. He fed her soup. taught her to trap rabbits, taught her to boil water for more than one purpose. She would be the first of many. Not students, not assassins, just listeners, wanderers, discards, the ones whose stories were never meant to survive the winter. He taught them how to preserve memory, with silence, with heat, with timing. A new kind of lineage formed, not of blood, of ashes. And the Tsar? He lived long, grew crueler. Paranoia nested in his chest like a second ribcage. He killed his own son in a fit of rage. He burned cities, founded others atop mass graves. But he never bathed again without tasting the water first. He never sat in a steam room, never touched copper. And in his final hours, withered breath raspy, eyes darting toward corners that held only dust, he whispered a name. Not to confess, not to apologize, to confirm that the story had been real, that the water still boiled. Yunus never returned to the palace. It wasn't necessary. His work had been to remind, and memory, once boiled in, never washes out. The final embers do not roar. They glow. A soft, steady heat. Not meant to frighten anymore, but to warm, to remind. A breath against winter's spine. A hush across centuries. Yunus lived until he did not. No records were kept of his death. No grave was marked. No witnesses spoke of the last moment his heart beat. There was no procession. No keening. No coin placed beneath his tongue. Only the stillness of a cabin gone cold, a hearth that had gone dark without fear, and a kettle left just beginning to boil. It was enough. Those who came after him did not call themselves a movement. They did not raise banners or carry creeds. There were no anthems. No formal doctrines. Just a memory of heat. Of what it meant. Of who they were before the scalding, and what they became after it. They became reminders. In courts where kings whispered to their meat before tasting it, they were there. In manors where lords demanded loyalty from lips they'd beaten bloody, they were there. In cities where the poor lined up for bread while the wealthy bathed in milk, they were there. They did not raise swords. They raised temperature. They taught that true change does not always come through revolt or riot. Sometimes it comes through waiting, through remembering the shape of cruelty's face, and knowing when to set the water to simmer. Decades passed. Generations turned over like soil. The story twisted, like all stories do. Yunus became myth, then legend. Then a ghost used to keep the wicked awake. They said he could smell guilt in your sweat. That he knew if your bathwater had ever run warmer than your servants'. That he could teach even stone to boil, if it had once looked away while someone screamed. And yet beneath the myth, the real man remained. Somewhere. Not in bone, but in gesture. In every kitchen where a cook serves a dish with quiet dignity. In every household where the help is addressed by name, with kindness. In every palace that keeps its bathhouse clean and empty, not from fear, but from respect. He became a pressure beneath the skin of history. A reminder that the lowest born could see what others refused to. That justice, real justice, is rarely loud, rarely beautiful, rarely triumphant. It is work. It is timing. It is heat. Long after the Tsar died, after his throne rotted and his dynasty cracked like frostbitten stone, the only structure still standing on the old palace grounds was the bathhouse. Not the original, of course. That had been bricked shut, condemned, forgotten. But someone, somewhere, had rebuilt it. Smaller. Simpler. A place for the public. For the people. And inside, carved in the lowest stone beneath the steam bench, in a hand both humble and steady, were 5 words. Heat is never just heat. And so we fade now, not with fire, but with warmth. Let the camera pan wide, a final drift across snow-covered roofs and the black spires of old Moscow curling into the night. The lights in the palace no longer flicker with opulence, only with memory. Shadows linger where footsteps once whispered revolution. The wind carries no cries, only steam rising from chimneys that do not know the names of their builders. The story is finished, but not ended. Because there will always be those at the bottom. Those whose names are scrubbed, whose backs are bent, whose mouths are burned shut. And there will always be those who forget that. Until they don't. Until one among them remembers. And turns up the heat. Quietly. Steadily. With purpose. Like Yunus. Like the steam. Like justice, boiling beneath the surface, waiting patiently. For the next bath.